Alright guys, this is just a quick, hopefully as quick as I can, quick video for beginners on an exercise or a movement called the hip hinge. Really important movement pattern that you practice at home because it's the one movement pattern I reckon that most folks struggle to get right away. Some folk do obviously, but others it takes a bit longer. So what is a hip hinge? Well, essentially there's two primary movements that engage your lower body: knee dominant movements and hip dominant movements. A knee dominant movement is a movement where the knee is the dominant mover, the dominant joint that moves. So for example, like a lunge. So when you lunge, there's a lot of flexion of the knee, extension of the knee, so your knee flexes and extends to perform the movement. So primarily, it's a knee dominant movement. A squat as well, there's a lot of knee bend, definitely more so than your hips. So a squat is probably considered a knee dominant movement. So most folk find these quite easy. Walking upstairs, knee dominant movement, lunges, etc., step ups. They're all knee dominant movements. They primarily work your quads, bring in the glutes as well. The movement that a lot of folks struggle with, on the other hand, is called a hip dominant movement or a hip hinge. And the clue is in the name. It means that the movement is dominated, or the primary mover in the movement is via the hips. So there's your hips there. So for example, this is a hip dominant movement. So what it means is that you're performing a movement, the hips are moving more than the knees. Okay, so as you can see, like, the knees here aren't moving that much, whereas the hips are moving back. Okay, they're flexing to go back the way, and then you stand back up to extend. So it's really worthwhile practicing this movement because it's the one that a lot of folks struggle with. A lot of folk immediately, as soon as they want to move like this, they start bending their knees because it's a sort of default thing to do. So you need to start to learn to dissociate your knees from your hips so that you can move and allow other muscles around the hips to be the primary movers in movement. For example, the hamstrings and the glutes. So this is an exercise and a movement I want you to just practice. So just sort of stand, keep your chest out, do it in a mirror, video yourself, and I want you to focus on just pushing your bum back the way, pushing your hips back, without letting your knees bend too much. You want them bent a wee bit, but don't do this. It's not a squat, okay? So I just want you to practice pushing the hips back and then standing back up. If you're doing this correctly, ultimately a hip hinge like this is a hamstring stretch. That is what it is. If someone asks you to try and touch your toes without, like, you might do that, right? But the whole idea is that you're trying to do it without doing that. You're trying to come down like this. So it's a stretch of the hamstrings. Okay, that's what a hip dominant sort of movement really is. So that is what we're looking for. That's what I want you to practice, and that's what we'll be practicing in the first week anyway, with kettlebells. For example, you could hold a kettlebell like this in front of you, or you could hold it behind you. We're working in a narrow stance like this, and all I want you to do is focus on pushing your chest out, and the goal is to keep your back nice and flat as you perform this movement. Okay, push your chest out, push your hips back. As your hips go back, don't let the kettlebell come out in front of you. I want you to imagine it's going to come down through the middle of your feet, so it's going to stay nice and close to your body. Okay, so you push your hips back. So there's a slight bend in your knee here, but like I said, the movement we want it to be hip dominant. So that means that the further you just push your hips back, and the kettlebell just starts to go down the way. So most folk, when they think, I need to get the kettlebell to the ground, what do? They bend their knees. That's a squat. It's not a hip dominant movement. We want you to push your hips back to get a stretch through your hamstrings. Ultimately, hip dominant movements like this are a stretch in the hamstrings. They're also really useful for sports, obviously, because the hamstrings are one of the key muscles in sprinting and running, for example. So this is something we just practice. The more you practice it at home as well, you pick it up faster. We want you to not round your back. So a lot of folks struggle at the start with this because they focus too much on getting the kettlebell down to the ground. So if they're not allowed to bend their knees, what they end up doing is this, okay, which is a different movement altogether. It's not necessarily bad for you. It's called a Jefferson curl, but it's not the exercise that we're looking for. What I want you to do in order to maximise the length of the hamstrings is to keep your back nice and straight. If you don't keep your back straight, there's not necessarily anything wrong with it, but you're not going to maximise the benefit of stretching the hamstrings under load and applying load to the hamstrings in the lengthened and stretched position like this. Okay, so that's why it's important that you keep your back flat keep the chest out, push the hips back. Okay, but we'll just take a bit of practice. And yeah, so that is the hip hinge. We're going to practice that